Hi everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Round Table here at the Center for Post-Christendom Studies. I'm really glad to have a couple of guests here with us today, Brian Clarke and Stuart Macdonald, who are the authors of the book Leaving Christianity, Changing Allegiances in Canada Since 1945. This is a great book for anyone who wants to familiarize themselves with some of the ways that the church has evolved and shifted and things have changed within the church in Canada. And also I think it's telling to all of many Western nations that have seen an evolution change in terms of the church's relationship with culture. And so while this is specifically Canadian, I'm sure and I know it can be informative for people who might be watching in other places too. So Brian, you're an instructor at Emmanuel College at the Toronto School of Theology in Toronto. Stuart is the professor of Church and Society at Knox College at the Toronto School of Theology, also obviously in Toronto. And it's just great to have you guys here today to talk a little bit about the book, but just as importantly about the things that you've discovered as a result of doing the research and writing of this book. So the book is about the changing relationship of the church within Canadian society and culture over the last 75 years. So I'm interested to know what brought you to this project. What made you decide you wanted to actually do this? A lot of work that goes into a book like this. So Stuart, maybe you can start.
I was doing a project and it looked at how my denomination, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, had been building new congregations. And none of it made sense because the idea was they were building all these new congregations and the church is shrinking. And it wasn't quite making sense. And just around that time, the results of the 2001 census came out. And the media story was that nothing has changed. But as I looked at the numbers, I went, wow, everything's changed. And because I happened to be on a research leave, I had a little bit of time to plunge into it. And at that point I went, there's something here. We've got to really start thinking about this. And I realized that the narrative might be different, that maybe it was only recently that things had gone down. And it was about that time I'd done some initial work that I went out and looked at Brian and shared it with him, and what happened then?
Well, I was working on another research project, but as soon as Stuart showed me some of his preliminary results from the 2001 census, what I realized is that this is a big story. If this is what's going on, if this is a long-term trend signifying a significant drift away from organized Christianity, then this is a trend that a lot of people are missing out on. And this has huge implications for teaching in the context that I teach in, which is like Stuart, we teach in a theological college context, where we teach classes to prepare people for ministry. And if this is what's going on, what we're doing at the moment isn't preparing people for the reality they're going to be facing in the congregations that they're going to be serving. Because what they are going to be facing, and our subsequent research has borne this out, I think, quite convincingly, is that it's not just one or two congregations or one or two denominations that are facing challenges with membership. It's really across the board. Certainly for mainstream Protestantism, United Church, Anglican Church, Presbyterian churches, but also denominations that would consider themselves theologically conservative are also facing challenges. The Salvation Army, for example, is facing a fairly significant decline in its adherence. So this is a widespread phenomenon, and one of the things that I had seen in my students is that they looked, when they look at the challenges that they're facing, they think that they are personal failures because they're not growing their congregation. And in reality, this is a broader thing than an individual congregation. I mean, I think the leadership in most congregations on a Thursday night when they meet down in the basement, one of the things they're talking about is how we're going to pay the bills because our membership is declining. And why is our membership declining? Because it's an older population. You know, most of the membership is probably over 50 years old. They're facing an existential threat. And the reason why I got involved in this project was because I realized that there were some major trends that we needed to uncover. And then we had to dig down and drill, because basically the top line is only the proverbial tip of the iceberg.
Right. Yeah, and we'll get into that, but obviously, because into some of the data and things that you did uncover. But obviously, it was a long project. It was.
Yes.
It sounds like it was at least a decade or more of
14 years.
14 years. Yeah. So it's in the book. It is very thorough, and it indicates that kind of careful research that you did. So maybe just to kind of get us thinking about some of the changes that have taken place, and I often tell this little anecdote. So I began in the late 80s as in pastoral ministry, and when I came into pastoral ministry in the 80s, in a denomination that was growing at that time, I kind of expected. I just thought if I work hard, if I preach reasonably well and run some good programs, that my church would grow. I mean, that was the expectation I had, and that's just 30 years ago. And for the first 10 years or so of my pastoral ministry, more or less kind of bore itself out. And then, but since then, in the middle of that, I began to realize things are changing. It's not like it was even when in the short 10 or 15 years. So what happened in kind of that global perspective? What were some of the key things that happened that kind of changed within the culture and then also within the church?
Well, I think you're right. Everyone in the 80s, it was down to questions of technique and things like that.
Yeah.
My own denomination thought if we just did this better and that. But what had really happened and what had really changed was much earlier than that. And one of the things that we found in the book that was so fascinating is that for the largest Protestant denominations in Canada, it was the late 50s and early 1960s when things started to change. So one of the things we discovered was that less people brought their children to baptism in traditions that baptized infants, starting in about 1958. And that's while the birth rate's going down. But even when we looked at that, it was still less of those children being born. And then it was the Sunday school, and then the membership. And those all began to change in about a 7-year period, for the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the United. And when we discovered that, we said something big has happened, and it's not something these churches themselves did. Something external has had an impact on them. And we were also aware of the literature that was on European churches and British churches, and that all started to make sense.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, sort of right after World War II, church attendance hits a very almost an all-time, or at least it spikes, right? And then it begins to decline. What things would you attribute? What would it be attributed to some of that? What was that about? Did you get into that at all in your research?
Sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, the 1960s ended up being, we think, is an epoch in itself. It was a turning point, not only for the church, but also for Canadian culture. So one of the things going into the 1960s, when you think about the 1950s, church going was a thing that people did. And not only something that people did, but they dressed up for, right? I mean, the Sunday suit for men, right? And there was a fair amount of pressure actually to go to church. Right? I mean, people would notice if you weren't there. And so one of the things that started happening in the 60s is that going to church, going to Sunday school becomes an option. Something you can do, or something you can choose not to do.
The cultural pressure lessens, and it's not
Right.
the same.
So one of the things that's really pivotal in the 1960s is the whole emphasis on individual autonomy. Right? That it's up to the individual to decide what their career is going to be. May not be what their family expectations were. For women to determine whether they will enter the workforce, and if so, in what capacity. right? And to do jobs that are equal to those of men. You start seeing that in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And pivotally in the 1960s, the whole issue of sexuality.
Right.
Starting first with married couples, but then spreading to those who are not married, and the insistence that individuals have a right to decide how they can express themselves sexually, whether it's premarital sex between men and women or homosexual sex or what have you. So it's this whole thing about individual autonomy, the individual deciding what is appropriate for them, right? And so one of the things that happens then is that you now have a proliferation of identities that one can choose from, right? You can choose to be a Roman Catholic, but one can also choose not to be a Roman Catholic, right? So a new category comes into existence in the 1960s and into the 70s, and it is, you don't have to have a religion.
Yeah.
Right? So in 1961, under 0.5% of individuals, when they were asked on the census, what's your religion? 0.5% said, I don't have one.
Yeah, 0.5%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in 1971, I think it goes up to about
4%.
4%. And
Which
then
is a
it
big increase.
Huge.
Yeah, it's 4% still sounds small, but that's a huge increase, isn't it? Yeah, over a decade.
Over a decade, and it's primarily located in just a few age cohorts, right? I mean, it's youth and young adults that are starting to feel that that's an option to them. And the thing is that the category of no religion keeps growing. Right, it starts at 4%, then it goes to 7%, then it goes to 12%, then it goes to 16%. Now in 2011, it's about a quarter of the population. So the thing about that category is that it's been growing decade in, decade out at about 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 times. So in the most recent decade, 2001 and 2011. Unfortunately, StatsCan only does these things every 10 years, and it takes them 2-3 years to process the results. So we're still talking about 2011, even though we're here in 2019. But, in that decade interval between 2001 and 2011, 2.9 million Canadians joined the cohorts of no religion.
Wow.
Right, to make it grosso modo, you're looking at about 7.8 million Canadians now say they don't have any religion. Yeah.
So we'll come back to that. I want to explore that a little bit further because that's such a significant trend, I think, in Canada and its relationship to the church. But I really like to, maybe you've already touched on some of this, but one of the great things about the book that it alone makes it worth having is the data that you guys offer. There's lots of charts and graphs, and but that alone is just illuminating in so many ways. As you guys were doing the research, was there any one or two, three, whatever, sort of pieces of data that came out and you said, "Wow, this is key," or "This surprised me to find this out"?
There were several. I think when we got the timing of the decline, baptisms and then Sunday school and then membership, and that all lined up for 3 denominations, that was quite surprising. When we, near the end of the project, finally got the Salvation Army numbers, because sometimes it was hard to get some of these statistics.
Yeah, some weren't really.
Yeah,
they were a little reluctant. Maybe
one can understand why. But we got those numbers, and they fit the pattern. That was surprising. I think another one for me was when we looked at the age of the United Church members in 1961, and they were not older than the average population. They now are, but they weren't. That was another surprising thing. So we kept being surprised by numbers. The other one that was, we looked into this whole question of no religion and what was it like in 1961. Well, the idea, at some point, it became, people seemed to understand that, well, it was only asked for the first time, that question, on the census in 1971. So when we looked at it in 61 and 51 and 41 and 31 and realized actually we know what that was all through that period, and it was always under 1% and growing tiny bits but basically stable. I mean, those are some of the data things that just flew off the page at me, that this is really significant. And so there are a lot of numbers, but we hope the numbers tell a story. And that was really what we tried to use them for.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Any comment there, Brian? Was there a particular discovery that you made along the journey that was for you an aha moment a little bit, or a moment of illumination?
Well, yeah. I mean, looking at the 1961 census, about 97% of the Canadian population identified themselves as belonging to one or another Christian denomination.
Wow, 97%.
Yeah. That just blew my mind.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw that figure, I'm going, my goodness. I mean,
why did it blow your mind? Because the culture we live in, it's hard to imagine that. Is that what? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just. And it's not just the fact. It's not just the fact that we have a kind of religious diversity that didn't exist in 1961, because that 3% would have been actually predominantly Jewish.
Yeah.
Right. 1.5% would have been Jews living in Canada, primarily in Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg. But now we have a much broader spectrum when it comes to religious diversity in terms of representation of global religions. But the other thing is, of course, this whole disengagement from organized religion from people who would have been traditionally brought up in Christian households. They're no longer there.
Yeah.
And that's the big change from the 97% in 1961. Because if you look at global religions now, what you're looking at maybe 6-7% of the Canadian population. So the rest of that is disengagement from people who would have been brought up traditionally, historically, in households that self-identified with some sort of Christian denomination.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think, Brian, you found was that when we did a lot of our work and we were at the 2001 census, and then we kind of paused waiting for the 2011 results, which came out in 2013. And you discovered in those that Roman Catholics were starting to lose their identity and were starting to move into no religion, which we hadn't seen before that. That was a really great finding.
Yeah, that was a surprise, because one of the things about Roman Catholics, the adage is that, once you're baptized as a Catholic, always a Catholic.
Always a Catholic, sure.
And that up until 2001, that was true. I mean, you can look at the stats. Yes, Roman Catholics, self-identified Roman Catholics increasingly are not going to church, particularly in Quebec. But they still, when they're asked that question for the census, what's your religion? I'm Roman Catholic. May never go to church.
Right.
Roman Catholic.
But still identified.
Still identified Roman
But
Catholic.
you see that shifting.
That's in the interval between 2001 and 2011, significantly in Quebec. I mean, no religion starts becoming a significant presence in Quebec for the first time. It's almost all Francophone. But also we're seeing this in the rest of Canada.
Yeah, I noticed that a chart in one of the graphs or charts it struck me when I was looking at it just the other day that there's the decline in Protestantism, where Protestants were at one time the primary religion in Canada, and it declines to a point where then Catholicism actually surpasses Protestantism. It's declining, but not nearly at the rate. But even that's shifting a little bit in the last decade or so, hey?
I mean, and there are two trends going on here. First of all, immigration patterns have changed.
Right.
So countries that would traditionally, that immigrants would traditionally come from, that were predominantly Christian, Catholic, no longer providing immigrants on the same scale. Philippines is one exception to this. But since Canada's changed, since patterns of immigration have changed in Canada, we're not seeing as many Christian immigrants coming. So that's, and most of them, since the 70s, that was predominantly Roman Catholic. But the other thing that we're starting to see is that Roman Catholics are now switching identity. They're switching to no religion. And that's a new trend. And what's also interesting in Quebec is that you've got people who are 65 years and older who are showing up with no religion. Notice people who self-identified for decades as Roman Catholic are switching.
Wow, it's an amazing shift that's taken place. And I think that's just a great description for us of kind of, or beginning description at least, of kind of how some of the hard data changes that are on the ground in terms of what's happening. I want to just thank you guys for giving us that little insight into some of these shifts. And of course, there's lots more about that in the book, Leaving Christianity, Changing Allegiances in Canada Since 1945. Our guests are Stuart Macdonald and Brian Clarke. And we're going to come back with more from these gentlemen in our next episode of The Round Table. Thanks for joining us today. Come back and join us for the second part of our interview subsequently. Thanks so much.